Every century believes Nostradamus predicted it. War, fire, kings falling, cities burning, the end of the world. His name appears in the aftermath of earthquakes. It surfaces in the smoke of burning towers. It rises with every election that feels like a reckoning, every pandemic that carries the weight of something foretold. People pull out old paperback books with his name on the cover. They scroll through websites. They share the same cryptic verses that have been shared for 500 years. And they say, "He saw this coming." But here is what makes that strange. He always sees it coming, after the fact. Nostradamus predicted World War II. He predicted the French Revolution. He predicted 9/11. He predicted the rise of Napoleon. He predicted the atomic bomb. He predicted the death of a 16th century king in a jousting tournament. And also, apparently, a comet strike, the collapse of the Internet, a third Antichrist, and something involving a great city being consumed by flame. He has been credited with predicting nearly everything that has ever gone wrong in Western history, which raises a question that his admirers rarely stop to ask. If a prophet predicts everything, does he predict anything at all? His real name was Michel de Nostredame. He was born in 1503 in the south of France, in a small town called Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. He was a physician. He was an astrologer. He was a writer who composed verses in a deliberately obscure mix of languages, layered with classical allusion, astrological symbols, and imagery so dense that it resisted easy interpretation. He published his most famous work, Les Prophéties, in 1555. It contained 942 short poems, quatrains, each 4 lines long, arranged in groupings called centuries. He published more editions before his death in 1566. He became famous during his own lifetime, invited to the French royal court. He died known and respected. And then he became something else, entirely. He became a mirror. Every generation since has held his verses up and found in them a reflection of their own fears. Every major crisis has revived his name. Every catastrophe has sent someone back to those 4-line poems, searching for the one that fits. The verses are vague. They are poetic. They mix concrete imagery with abstract symbolism. They name places, but not always accurately. They describe events, but almost never specify dates. They are, in short, exactly the kind of writing that can be bent to mean almost anything. But that is not a flaw. That is the design. This is not a story about a man who could see the future. It is a story about why we need to believe that someone can. The mystery of Nostradamus is not the quatrains. The mystery is us. Was he a prophet or a master of ambiguity? To answer that question, we need to go back to the beginning, to a small town in Provence, to a boy born into a world where the future was genuinely uncertain, and death was the most reliable forecast anyone had. Saint-Rémy-de-Provence in the early 16th century was a market town in the south of France, sun-baked, surrounded by lavender fields and limestone hills, prosperous enough to have its own cathedral and its own weekly market, small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. Michel de Nostredame was born there on December 14th, 1503. The world he was born into is difficult to imagine from the vantage point of the 21st century. Not because it was primitive. The Renaissance was already underway, and the printing press had been transforming European culture for 50 years. The difficulty is something else. It was a world in which uncertainty was not an anxiety to be managed. It was the basic condition of existence. You did not know if you would survive the winter. You did not know if your children would live past the age of 5. You did not know if the harvest would come in, if the river would flood, if the plague would return. And you did not know, this was, perhaps, the most unsettling thing of all, what the Church might think of you. France in 1503 was a deeply Catholic country in the middle of enormous religious tension. The Reformation was still years away. Martin Luther would not nail his theses to the church door until 1517. But the pressures that would eventually explode into religious war were already building. Heresy was not an abstraction. It was a crime. People died for their beliefs, and the line between acceptable faith and dangerous heterodoxy was not always clear. Into this environment was born a boy whose family carried a complicated history. The Nostradame family, or at least part of it, had Jewish origins. His great-grandparents had converted to Christianity, a practice that was not unusual in southern France in the late 15th century. Jews who converted, known as conversos or New Christians, occupied an ambiguous social position. They were legally Christian. They were often educated. But they were also frequently suspected of secret Jewish practice, of maintaining old loyalties beneath a Christian exterior. Whether the Nostradame family continued any Jewish practices is unknown. What is documented is that they were educated, reasonably prosperous, and deeply invested in learning. Michel's grandfathers, he had two, were both physicians. One, Jean de Saint-Remy, was also an astrologer who had served at the court of René d'Anjou, the Duke of Provence. The other, Pierre de Nostredame, was a grain merchant turned doctor. This is significant. Michel de Nostredame grew up in a household where medicine and astrology were not separate disciplines. In the early 16th century, they weren't. Astrology was considered a legitimate branch of natural philosophy. The movements of celestial bodies were believed to influence health, weather, agriculture, and the fates of kingdoms. A physician who did not consider the stars when treating a patient was considered incomplete. The boy was educated early and carefully. His grandfathers taught him Latin, Greek, Hebrew, mathematics, and astrology. He was sent to Avignon for further schooling, one of the great intellectual centers of southern France, where he was exposed to classical learning, rhetoric, and the natural sciences as they were understood in the Renaissance. He was, by all accounts, an exceptionally able student. Curious, retentive, interested in medicine, in plants, in the natural world. He had the kind of mind that wanted to understand how things worked. But the world around him did not always offer explanations. Plague was not a historical memory in early 16th century France. It was a recurring reality. The Black Death of the 14th century had killed roughly a third of Europe's population, and though the worst was over, outbreaks continued for centuries afterward. A plague might come to your town in any given year. It might kill your neighbors. It might kill your family. It moved through communities without obvious logic, appearing suddenly, killing apparently at random, and then disappearing again, leaving behind a silence that no one fully understood. Medicine had no real answer to plague. The causes were debated: bad air, astrological conjunctions, divine punishment, miasma. The treatments varied from bloodletting to herbal remedies, to isolation to prayer. What was consistent was the helplessness. You watched people die and you could not stop it. This is the world that shaped Michel de Nostredame. A world where death was ordinary, where tomorrow was uncertain, where the future pressed in from all sides, unpredictable and often terrible. In a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed, prediction felt powerful. He enrolled at the University of Montpellier in 1522 to study medicine. Montpellier was one of the finest medical schools in Europe. It had been admitting students for 300 years. It had connections to Arabic medicine, to the classical tradition of Galen and Hippocrates, to the emerging empirical approach that was slowly beginning to challenge ancient authority. He was 22 years old. He was, by the standards of his time, well prepared. He was expelled within weeks. The official reason was that he had practiced as an apothecary before completing his medical degree, which was against university rules. Some scholars have suggested other factors: his family's converso background, his already evident willingness to challenge received wisdom. The reasons are not entirely clear. What is clear is that the expulsion did not end his medical career. It redirected it. For several years, he traveled through southern France. He studied under a physician named Jules César Scaliger, a humanist scholar and physician of formidable reputation, and, by most accounts, a formidable personality to match. He learned the practical side of medicine, not just theory, but the actual treatment of patients, the preparation of remedies, the observation of disease. And then the plague came. Somewhere in the late 1520s, the exact dates are uncertain, Nostradamus encountered a major outbreak of plague in Provence. He did not flee. He worked. He moved from town to town, treating the sick, developing his own remedies, earning a reputation for effectiveness at a time when most physicians either had nothing useful to offer or were too frightened to try. His methods were unusual for the time. He emphasized cleanliness. He instructed patients to remove the corpses of the dead, to clean clothing, to improve sanitation. He developed herbal preparations. He avoided the bloodletting that was standard practice. He focused on what actually seemed to help rather than on what the textbooks prescribed. Whether his methods were effective in any modern pharmacological sense is uncertain. What is documented is that people in the towns he visited survived at higher rates than might otherwise have been expected, and that his reputation grew accordingly. He was, in the language of his time, someone who could help when others could not. He eventually returned to Montpellier, completed his degree, and was readmitted to practice. He married. He had children. He settled in Agen, in southwestern France, and for a time his life seemed to have found a settled trajectory. And then, sometime around 1534, the plague returned. This time, it killed his wife. It killed his children. We do not have his own account of this loss. He was not a confessional writer in the modern sense, but the effect of this catastrophe can be inferred from what came after. His practice collapsed. A physician who could not save his own family was not a physician anyone trusted. His father-in-law sued him for the return of his wife's dowry. He lost his home. He left Agen. For the next several years, he wandered. This is where the record becomes sparse. He traveled through France and possibly into Italy. He continued to practice medicine. He continued to encounter plague. He continued to work. And somewhere in those wandering years, between the loss of his first family and the eventual rebuilding of his life, something in his thinking shifted. Consider what he had lived through by his early 30s. He had grown up watching disease move through communities like a tide. He had trained in a discipline that offered more ritual than remedy. He had spent years walking into the most feared environments in Europe, towns under active plague, and had come out the other side. He had survived things that killed most people around him. And then, when he thought he had found safety, he had lost everything anyway. What does that do to a person? It does several things. It can produce fatalism, the sense that outcomes are beyond human control, that all we can do is observe and endure. It can produce pattern-seeking, the mind's desperate attempt to find the logic behind apparently random events, to identify the warning signs that precede disaster so that next time, perhaps, we can prepare. And it can produce a particular kind of insight, the recognition that most people are living in denial, that they believe the world is more stable and predictable than it actually is. A person who has walked through enough catastrophe begins to see the world differently, not with despair necessarily, but with a kind of clear-eyed awareness of fragility that others lack. Nostradamus had seen how suddenly everything could change. He had seen how little warning the future gave. He had seen how people looked for signs and found none, or found signs and misread them. He had also seen how much people needed those signs, even when they were wrong. When you live through enough disasters, you begin to think in warnings. He eventually rebuilt his life. He remarried, a wealthy widow named Anne Ponsard, and settled in Salon de Provence, where he would live for the rest of his life. He had more children. He reestablished his medical practice. He began, tentatively at first, to write. His early writing was not prophecy. It was practical. He wrote an almanac, a common form of publication in the 16th century that combined weather predictions, agricultural advice, and astrological forecasts for the year ahead. He translated an ancient text on herbal remedies. He wrote about cosmetics and medical preparations. These were not obscure or mystical documents. They were the kind of practical, applied writing that an educated physician of his era might produce. They were useful. They sold. But his relationship with the medical establishment remained fraught. The problem was not his competence. By most accounts, Nostradamus was a capable and innovative physician. The problem was his independence. He did not practice according to the strict guidelines of the medical guilds. He developed his own remedies rather than following approved protocols. He had opinions about treatments that differed from the consensus. And he was not shy about sharing those opinions. The medical establishment of the 16th century was not a flexible institution. It was hierarchical, tradition-bound, and deeply invested in the authority of ancient texts. To deviate from Galenic medicine, the medical tradition descended from the ancient Greek physician Galen, was not merely incorrect, it was presumptuous. It suggested that a practicing physician knew better than a tradition that stretched back over 1,000 years. Nostradamus clearly thought he sometimes did. He was also, by temperament, something of an outsider. He had been expelled from university. He had converso ancestry in a period of religious suspicion. He had wandered for years rather than building a stable institutional base. He was known for his almanacs, which were popular but not prestigious. He occupied an awkward middle ground between respected practitioner and controversial freelancer. This position had a specific danger in the 16th century. The Inquisition was not a relic of the distant past. It was an active institution. In southern France, in the decades of Nostradamus' practice, people were investigated for heresy, for witchcraft, for unauthorized religious practice. The line between natural medicine and forbidden magic was not always clearly drawn. A physician who used unusual remedies, who had Jewish ancestry, who made predictions that appeared to come true, such a person could attract unwanted attention. Nostradamus appears to have been genuinely aware of this danger. There are accounts of him giving deliberately vague answers when asked direct questions about his beliefs or methods. He was careful. He was cautious. He understood that candor could be dangerous. This caution would later shape everything he wrote. He was not a court magician. He was not a wandering mystic. He was not an eccentric hermit consulting spirits in a tower. He was a trained physician, educated in Latin and Greek, familiar with classical philosophy and astrology, embedded, however uneasily, in the intellectual culture of Renaissance France. He was a professional. He understood reputation. He understood how knowledge was transmitted and how it was received. He understood the difference between what you believed privately and what it was safe to say publicly. And then he stopped writing about medicine and started writing about the future. Les Prophéties was first published in 1555. The initial edition contained 3 complete centuries and part of a 4th, roughly 350 quatrains. Later editions added more, eventually reaching the 942 that most versions include today. He continued to work on the project until his death in 1566. The choice of form was unusual. Prophecy in the 16th century typically came in prose, in the form of visions, divine communications, or interpretations of Scripture. Nostradamus chose to write in verse, specifically in quatrains, 4-line poems with a specific rhyme scheme, compact and self-contained. He also chose to write in a language that was deliberately difficult to parse. The quatrains mix Middle French with Latin, Greek, and occasional Spanish and Italian. They use classical allusions drawn from ancient history and mythology. They employ astrological terminology. They use anagrams, portmanteau words, invented place names, and symbolic imagery. They are not, by any standard, in any era, easy to read. This is not an accident. In the preface to Les Prophéties, addressed to his infant son, César, Nostradamus himself explained his approach. He wrote that he had deliberately obscured his meaning, that he had concealed his prophecies so that they could not be immediately understood, so that they would not cause panic, and so that only those with the right knowledge could decode them. Some scholars take this at face value. Others read it as sophisticated self-protection. Both interpretations are probably partially correct. Consider the situation from his perspective. He was a physician with a complicated background, writing in a period of intense religious scrutiny, publishing predictions about the future of kingdoms and rulers. To write clearly, to say plainly that this king would die, that this city would burn, that this war would end badly, was to invite immediate and dangerous attention. If the prediction was unflattering to powerful people, clarity was a liability. Obscurity, on the other hand, was a kind of armor. A verse that could mean one thing or 5 things could not be prosecuted for sedition. A prediction that required interpretation could not be definitively proved wrong. A poem that blended historical allusion with future possibility existed in a space that was resistant to both political attack and simple refutation. But there is another dimension to the obscurity, one that Nostradamus may or may not have understood consciously. Vague language is extraordinarily powerful in the context of prediction. Consider a verse that describes a great leader rising in the West, accompanied by fire and iron, who will change the order of the old world. That could be Napoleon. It could be Hitler. It could be a medieval warlord. It could be a business titan. It could be almost anyone, in almost any era, who rose to prominence through force or will and disrupted existing power structures. The verse does not become more accurate over time. It becomes more applicable. Every generation finds someone new to fit it. This is not a failure of prophecy. It is the mechanism of prophecy. The most durable predictive writing is writing that deals in universals. Conflict between old and new, the rise and fall of powerful individuals, fire and destruction, the suffering of the innocent, the arrogance of rulers. These things happen in every century, in every culture. A text that describes them in sufficiently general terms will always find a home in the present moment. Nostradame was steeped in classical history. He knew that the patterns of human behavior repeat. He had read about the cycles of empire, the recurring dynamics of ambition and collapse. Whether he believed he was transmitting genuine prophecy, or whether he was encoding historical patterns in poetic form, is a question we cannot answer with certainty. What we can say is this: he understood his audience. He understood that people in crisis reach for meaning. And he gave them language flexible enough to hold any meaning they needed. A prediction that can mean anything can survive anything. On June 30th, 1559, King Henry II of France entered a jousting tournament in Paris to celebrate the double wedding of his daughter and his sister. He was 40 years old, an accomplished knight, in excellent health. His opponent in one of the final bouts was Gabriel de Montgomery, the captain of his Scottish Guard. During the joust, Montgomery's lance struck Henry's helmet. The lance shattered. A splinter penetrated the visor and entered the king's eye. Henry was knocked from his horse. He was carried from the field. He died 10 days later from infection and brain injury. It was one of the most consequential deaths in French history. The king's death threw the kingdom into political crisis, accelerated the religious tensions that would soon become the wars of religion, and profoundly disrupted the balance of power in Europe. And Nostradame, people said, had predicted it. The quatrain most often cited is Century 1, Quatrain 35. In a rough translation, it describes two fighters doing battle in a golden cage, the older one overcoming the younger. 2 wounds, a cruel death, and a golden one dying in a painful end. The interpretation that emerged after Henry's death goes roughly as follows. The golden cage is the royal tournament grounds. The fighters are the jousting opponents. The older one overcoming the younger is Henry, older than Montgomery, initially gaining the upper hand. The 2 wounds are the 2 wounds to the eye. The cruel death is the 10-day agony that followed. The golden one is Henry himself, whose tournament armor was golden. It sounds in that rendering remarkably specific, but it is worth examining carefully. The word the translation renders as golden cage was in the original Old French a term that could mean cage but also enclosure, field, or arena. The golden one could be the armor, but the word also simply meant shining or radiant. The 2 wounds were later identified as the splinter to the eye and a separate wound to the throat. But this identification came after the fact, as interpreters worked backward from the event to find the match. More importantly, the quatrain was published in 1555, 4 years before Henry's death. But there is no documented evidence that anyone before Henry's death read this quatrain as a prediction of his specific fate. This is the central problem with most Nostradamus predictions. They are not identified before the event. They are identified after. A catastrophe occurs, and interpreters scan the quatrains for the verse that, with appropriate squinting and liberal translation, appears to match. The matching is then presented as evidence of prophecy. This is not how prediction works. A genuine prediction identifies the specific event in advance with enough precision to be falsifiable, to be provably wrong if it does not occur. What Nostradamus' interpreters do is something different. They find a match after the fact, using verses whose language is flexible enough to accommodate multiple interpretations. This is not to say the Henry II interpretation is entirely without interest. Some elements of the quatrain do connect in ways that are at least suggestive. Whether that connection is genuine foresight, coincidence, or creative retrofitting remains a legitimate question. But the history of this particular prediction illustrates the pattern that recurs again and again. The prediction became famous only after it appeared to come true. There is a phenomenon that psychologists call apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things, to see faces in clouds, to hear words in static, to find patterns in randomness. It is not a disorder, it is a feature. The human brain evolved to find patterns. In an environment where survival depended on recognizing the connection between the rustle in the grass and the presence of a predator, pattern recognition was not a philosophical luxury. It was a survival mechanism. The brain that found patterns, even false ones, was better off than the brain that did not. False positives were annoying but survivable. False negatives could be lethal. The result is a brain that is very, very good at finding patterns and not always careful about whether those patterns are real. We see faces in wallpaper. We hear music in rain. We find meaning in coincidence. We look for the reason behind misfortune. We ask why. We insist on why. The universe does not owe us explanations, but we demand them anyway. This is the psychological foundation on which prophecy rests. When something terrible happens, when a loved one dies unexpectedly, when a city is attacked, when a war begins, the human response is not merely grief. It is the urgent need to understand. Not just how. Why? Was there a warning? Could it have been prevented? Was this foreseen? The comfort of foresight, even imagined foresight, is profound. If the disaster was predicted, if someone saw it coming, then the world is not purely chaotic. There is an order beneath the surface. The future is, at some level, knowable. And if the future is knowable, then it is, in some sense, manageable. Nostradamus' quatrains are perfectly engineered, whether deliberately or by accident, to provide this comfort. Consider their structure. They are short. Each one is self-contained. They use specific-sounding imagery: cities, rivers, kings, battles, celestial events, that creates an impression of concreteness without actually being concrete. They are in a language that requires translation and interpretation, which gives the interpreter significant latitude. And they number nearly 1,000, which means that for any given event, there are 942 possible matches to search through. Statisticians and psychologists have a term for what happens when you search a large enough text for matches to a specific event. You will find them. Not because the text predicted the event, but because the text is large enough and vague enough that some portion of it will, after interpretation, appear to describe almost any significant event. This is sometimes called the Bible code fallacy. The idea that a text, whether the Bible or Nostradamus' quatrains, contains hidden predictions for every event in history, is not evidence of supernatural foresight. It is evidence of how flexible language becomes when you apply enough interpretive pressure. But understanding the mechanism does not make the need go away. After September 11, 2001, a verse attributed to Nostradamus circulated widely online as a prediction of the attacks. It described the great city of terror in the 7th month of the year, and fire falling from the sky. The verse spread rapidly. It was shared millions of times. The problem was that the verse was not by Nostradamus at all. It was written by a student in the 1990s as a creative writing exercise demonstrating how easy it was to write a Nostradamus-style quatrain. Someone stripped the attribution, added the claim that it was a genuine Nostradamus verse, and released it into a grief-stricken, information-hungry public. It didn't matter that it was fake. People needed it to be real. That is perhaps the most telling fact about the Nostradamus phenomenon. Not that his genuine verses are misinterpreted, but that fake verses, written to sound like him, are accepted and spread without question. Because the need they fill is real, even when the verses themselves are not. Confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out information that confirms what we already believe, plays its own role. Once you believe that Nostradamus predicted something, you look for the verse that matches. You find it, or something close to it. You translate the ambiguous words in the way that fits best. You note the connections and discount the discrepancies. You walk away with your belief confirmed. What you do not do, what confirmation bias makes very hard to do, is apply the same scrutiny to the verses that don't fit. The ones that describe events that never happened. The ones that promised specific dates and were wrong. The ones that are simply too obscure to connect to anything at all. There are plenty of those. No one shares them online. Prophecy survives not because it is clear, but because it is flexible. The pattern is consistent enough that you could set a clock by it. A major crisis occurs. Within days, sometimes hours, someone produces a Nostradamus verse that appears to have predicted it. The verse spreads. Books are written. Documentaries are made. His name trends on whatever communication technology exists at the time. Pamphlets, newspapers, radio, television, the internet. And then things stabilize. The crisis passes, or becomes familiar, or is overtaken by the next crisis. The verse fades from circulation. The books gather dust. His name retreats to the background. Until the next time. The French Revolution drew heavily on Nostradamus. His verses about kings falling, about violent upheaval in France, about rivers running red, all were retroactively applied to the events of 1789 and after. Pamphlet writers on both sides of the Revolution claimed him. Royalists cited verses that seemed to predict the monarchy's restoration. Revolutionaries cited others that seemed to predict the old order's collapse. The same body of text served contradictory political purposes simultaneously. Napoleon generated his own Nostradamus industry. The quatrains that described a great leader from the South, a man of unusual power who would reshape Europe. These were widely applied to the Corsican general who rose from obscurity to become emperor. Never mind that Corsica is an island, not technically part of continental southern France. Never mind that the descriptors fit dozens of historical figures. Napoleon fit. That was enough. The 20th century produced perhaps the most famous Nostradamus interpretation of all. The claim that he predicted Adolf Hitler and World War II. The verse most often cited describes Hester, a Germanic word, raising a great army from the east, causing enormous destruction. For decades, interpreters argued that Hester was an anagram or variant spelling of Hitler. The problem, known to scholars, ignored in popular retellings, is that Hister was a classical Latin name for the lower Danube River. Nostradame used classical allusions extensively. A reference to Hister in the context of Germanic conflict is almost certainly a reference to the Danube region, not a phonetic near miss for a 20th century dictator. But the interpretation was appealing. It made Nostradame seem like a man who had stared across 4 centuries and seen the Third Reich. World War I, World War II, the Kennedy assassination, the moon landing, the Iran hostage crisis, the Challenger disaster, the fall of the Soviet Union, the Gulf War, the September 11th attacks, the 2004 tsunami, Hurricane Katrina, the 2008 financial crisis. Every one of these events, and many more, has at some point been claimed as a Nostradame prediction. In each case, the quatrain was identified after the event. In each case, the interpretation required significant translation work and liberal reading. In each case, discrepancies were minimized and correspondences were emphasized. The quatrains themselves never change. They sit there in their 16th century French, waiting. What changes is the reader, and the event the reader brings to them. There is something worth noticing about the specific events that trigger Nostradame revivals. They are almost always catastrophic. They involve mass death, or the destruction of familiar structures, or the sudden vulnerability of things we believed were permanent. They are, in short, the kind of events that most powerfully activate the human need for explanation. Minor disasters do not revive his name. Slow-moving crises do not revive his name. But the sudden, the violent, the incomprehensible, those do. Because those are precisely the moments when the brain reaches hardest for the comfort of foresight. The text never changes. Only the reader does. This is perhaps the most interesting question about Nostradame, and the one for which we have the least direct evidence. Did he believe he was a genuine prophet? Did he think he was actually seeing the future? To understand the question, you need to understand how astrology was understood in the 16th century. Not as it is understood today, as a personality system sold in the back pages of magazines, but as it was genuinely theorized in Renaissance natural philosophy. Astrology in Nostradame's era was a serious intellectual discipline. It was taught at universities. It was practiced by educated physicians. It was consulted by rulers, generals, and popes. The underlying theory, and that the movements of celestial bodies influenced events on Earth, was not considered superstition. It was considered part of the natural order. The theoretical basis was this: the heavens and the earth are part of a single connected system. The influence flows downward, from the celestial to the terrestrial. By studying the positions and movements of the planets and stars, a skilled astrologer could infer the tendencies of future events, the likely outcome of military campaigns, the health prospects of rulers, the fortune of kingdoms in a given year. This was not, in the intellectual context of the Renaissance, a fringe belief. It was the mainstream. Nostradame did not believe in astrology despite being educated. He believed in it partly because he was educated. It was part of the curriculum of natural philosophy. So, when he wrote about the future, he was working within a theoretical framework that considered such writing legitimate. But he also claimed something more than standard astrological prediction. In his prefaces, to his son Caesar, and later to King Henry II, he described a kind of divine inspiration, a light that came to him in the night hours, a prophetic fire that allowed him to see beyond what ordinary astrology could reach. How seriously should we take this? One possibility is that he meant it literally, that he genuinely experienced something, dreams, visions, altered states, that he interpreted as prophetic inspiration. Mystical experience is not rare. The line between sincere religious vision and psychological phenomenon was not clearly drawn in the 16th century. It is not entirely clearly drawn today. Another possibility is that the language of divine inspiration was protective. To claim that your prophecies came from God, or at minimum from divinely guided celestial science, was to place them in a category that was harder for the Church to prosecute. A prophet is dangerous. A lunatic is ignored. A man guided by God occupies a more complex space. A third possibility is that Nostradamus was doing something more sophisticated than either, writing in a tradition that was expected to claim divine inspiration, because that was the genre. Prophetic writing in the 16th century conventionally included such claims. It was part of the form. He was an intelligent, educated, pragmatic man who had survived difficult things by being careful. He was also someone who genuinely worked within the intellectual framework of Renaissance astrology and natural philosophy. He probably held beliefs about celestial influence and the nature of time that we would find unusual today, and that he held sincerely. Whether he believed he was receiving divine communication, or whether he was engaged in a sophisticated literary project that used the forms of prophecy without making literal truth claims, is something we cannot know. The evidence supports both interpretations partially. What we can say is that he was not naive. He was not an eccentric true believer disconnected from the realities of his world. He was a careful, strategic writer who understood exactly what he was doing and exactly what risks he was taking. Whether he also believed, in some part of himself, that he was genuinely seeing the future, that question he took with him. In 1555, the same year that Les Prophéties first appeared, Nostradamus was summoned to Paris. The invitation came from Catherine de' Medici, the queen consort of Henry II. Catherine de' Medici is one of the most fascinating figures of the 16th century. A Florentine noblewoman who had married into the French royal family at age 14, and spent the subsequent decades navigating the treacherous politics of the French court. She was pragmatic, intelligent, politically astute, and deeply interested in astrology. She collected astrologers the way other powerful people collected advisors. She had read Nostradamus' almanacs. She was impressed, or at least interested. She wanted to meet him. He traveled to Paris in the summer of 1555. He met Catherine. He likely met Henry II. He cast horoscopes for the royal children. He was, by all accounts, well received. He returned home with his reputation significantly elevated. This encounter illustrates something important about the social function of prophecy in the 16th century. It was not separate from power. It was adjacent to power. Rulers consulted astrologers and prophets not because they were naive, but because in a world of limited information, any edge, any framework for thinking about future possibilities, had value. An astrologer who could provide a plausible structure for thinking about upcoming events was a useful addition to a court. But there was also something else at work. Prophecy was a form of reputation, and reputation in the 16th century was a form of power. Nostradamus understood the printing press. This matters enormously. He was writing in the first century of widespread printed communication, when the ability to reach a large audience through published text was transforming European culture. The Reformation was, among other things, a media revolution. Luther's ideas spread because they could be printed, copied, and distributed faster than the church could respond. Nostradame was not writing political theology, but he was using the same medium with a similar understanding of its power. His almanacs were popular publications. They sold, they were reprinted, they circulated through France and beyond. His name became a brand, a recognizable marker of authoritative prediction that carried weight precisely because it was attached to a printed, published body of work. Les Prophéties was not just a collection of verses. It was a reputation-making project. By publishing nearly 1,000 predictions stretching across centuries, predictions that were, by design, resistant to definitive falsification, he created a permanent archive that would outlast any specific success or failure. Even if many of his predictions proved wrong, no one would be able to say they were all wrong. The sheer volume ensured that some would appear to connect to future events, and the obscurity ensured that the connections could always be found by someone at some point. The timing of the publication also matters. 1555 was a moment of genuine anxiety in France. Religious wars were approaching. The political situation was unstable. People were genuinely frightened about the future. A respected physician and astrologer who published a serious, learned work of prophetic verse was offering something that met a real demand. He was also, it should be noted, selling something. The almanacs were commercial products. Les Prophéties was a commercial product. Royal patronage brought prestige and financial security. The prophecy business, in short, was a business. That does not mean it was insincere. The two things are not mutually exclusive. A person can genuinely believe in what they are selling, and also understand that it sells. Nostradame probably occupied exactly that complex space, sincere enough in his intellectual framework to work within it, strategic enough to shape his output for maximum impact and longevity. He was, in ways that are still recognizable, a public intellectual. He understood audience. He understood form. He understood how to build and maintain a reputation. He was very good at it. The Nostradame of historical record and the Nostradamus of popular imagination are two different figures who share a name. The historical figure was a physician who practiced during plague outbreaks in Renaissance France. He was educated in the classical tradition, in medicine, and in astrology. He wrote almanacs, herbal treatises, and a collection of prophetic verses that he published in middle age. He was ambitious, cautious, strategic, and genuinely learned. He had a complicated relationship with institutional authority. He was successful enough to attract royal patronage. He died in Salon de Provence in July 1566, reportedly telling his assistant the night before, "You will not find me alive at sunrise." He was buried in the local Franciscan chapel. His tomb was later moved and desecrated. His grave is now in the Collégiale Saint-Laurent in Salon, still visited by tourists. The mythological figure is something else entirely. In popular mythology, Nostradamus is a time traveler in literary form, a man who somehow leapt across centuries and left a complete record of everything that would happen, encoded in verse, waiting to be decoded. He predicted the French Revolution and the World Wars, and the nuclear age and the Internet, and the coronavirus pandemic and whatever comes next. He is consulted by people who believe his quatrains contain a map of history. He is cited by apocalyptic movements as proof that the end is coming. He is treated as a kind of secular oracle, a figure whose authority exceeds ordinary knowledge because it comes from outside time itself. The gap between the two figures is not just a matter of exaggeration, It is a matter of category. The historical Nostradame was a product of his era. His intellectual framework, astrology, natural philosophy, classical learning, Renaissance medicine, was the standard framework of a certain kind of educated person in 16th century France. His prophetic project was ambitious, but it was ambitious within recognizable parameters. He was doing something that was understood within his culture as a legitimate intellectual endeavor. The mythological Nostradamus belongs to a different intellectual tradition entirely, one that values hidden knowledge, secret codes, supernatural insight, and the existence of special individuals who transcend the ordinary limits of human cognition. This tradition has no single origin, but it draws on folk belief in prophecy, on the romantic fascination with the occult that emerged in the 19th century, on the specifically modern anxiety about the future that intensified after the world wars, and on the basic human desire to believe that someone, somewhere, knows what is coming. The mythological version was not created by Nostradame. It was created by his readers, and it has been rebuilt generation by generation, each time fitted with new content to match new anxieties. This process of myth-making is not unique to Nostradame. Many historical figures have been transformed by posterity into something their contemporary selves would not recognize. The Nostradame case is simply unusually clear. We have enough historical documentation to see the gap between the man and the myth quite distinctly. The real Nostradame was not consulting supernatural forces. He was not receiving transmissions from the future. He was a trained professional, working within the intellectual assumptions of his time, who understood how to write in ways that would last, and he succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. The myth he became is not a distortion of his work. It is, in a sense, the completion of it. He wrote verses designed to be interpreted across time. And they have been, just not quite in the way that people who believe in the myth suppose. There is a specific quality that makes Nostradame uniquely durable as a cultural figure, and it is not the accuracy of his predictions. It is the completeness of his incompleteness. His quatrains are unfinished in a specific way. They are not merely vague, they are tantalizing. They contain specific-sounding imagery alongside genuinely obscure symbolism. They are short enough to be memorable, long enough to contain multiple interpretable elements. They exist in a language that requires translation, and translation always introduces ambiguity. And they number nearly 1,000, which creates the impression of a comprehensive archive of the future. This combination produces something unique, a text that feels like it should be decodable without ever being fully decoded. The meaning seems to be there, just out of reach, waiting for the right interpreter in the right moment. And that feeling, the feeling of a hidden truth tantalizingly close, is one of the most persistent motivators of human attention. There is also something specific about the nature of his subject matter. He wrote about fear. His quatrains are overwhelmingly concerned with catastrophe, war, plague, famine, the fall of rulers, the destruction of cities, the end of things. He was not writing about joy or prosperity or ordinary life. He was writing about what people are most afraid of. Fear is, among other things, a kind of attention. When we are afraid, we look for information that might help us understand the threat. We look for patterns. We look for warning signs. We look for someone who might know something we don't. Nostradame's text is a permanent address for that kind of fearful attention-seeking. Every generation that faces catastrophe, and every generation has faced catastrophe, sends some portion of itself to his verses. But there is something even more fundamental at work. Human beings live in time but cannot see forward in time. This is perhaps the defining asymmetry of conscious experience. We remember the past. We anticipate the future. But we cannot know it. We can plan, we can prepare, we can estimate probabilities, but we cannot see what is coming with certainty. This is genuinely difficult, not just practically, but existentially. The uncertainty of the future is a constant source of anxiety. Every decision we make involves a bet on an unknown outcome. Every investment, every relationship, every health decision, every choice about where to live and how to live, all of it is made in partial ignorance of the future. Nostradamus offers a fantasy of resolution to this anxiety. Not in the sense that his predictions are accurate, they're not, reliably, but in the sense that his existence suggests the possibility that the future is knowable, that it is not pure randomness, that there is a shape to history, an order beneath the surface, and that at least one person in the past managed to glimpse it. If he could see the future, then the future can be seen. And if the future can be seen, then perhaps we are not as helpless as we feel. That is the real function of Nostradamus in modern culture. Not prediction, not prophecy, the management of existential anxiety. And that function does not diminish over time, because the anxiety does not diminish over time. New threats arise, new catastrophes occur, new anxieties find new objects, and in each new moment of fear, the same ancient verses wait to be consulted. His longevity is not about accuracy, it is about timing. He appears at exactly the moments when he is most needed, when fear is highest, when uncertainty is most acute, when the future feels most threatening. He appears not because he predicted anything correctly. He appears because something terrible has just happened, and people are reaching for anything that might make it meaningful. This is his real achievement. Not that he saw the future, but that he created a text capacious enough to hold every generation's fears, a mirror that always shows what the viewer most needs to see. Michel de Nostredame died in the early morning hours of July 2nd, 1566. He was 62 years old. He had been ill, suffering from gout and cardiac complications for some time. He had made arrangements. He updated his will, settled his affairs, left instructions for his burial. He died, by all available accounts, as he had lived, practically, carefully, with attention to what could actually be managed. He left behind a large body of work, his almanacs, his herbal writings, his letters, his astrological work for royal patrons, and, of course, Les Prophéties, which had been through multiple editions and had already made him famous throughout France and beyond. He could not have known what would happen to that work after his death, how it would be reprinted, reinterpreted, translated, Bowdlerized, expanded with fake editions, weaponized by different political factions, revised to match new events, and consulted by millions of people in centuries he would never see. Or perhaps he had some sense of it. He was, after all, a man who understood how meaning is made. He understood that language persists, and that language persists most powerfully when it resists definitive interpretation. He understood that people in crisis reach for written words the way a drowning person reaches for anything solid. He understood that the relationship between a text and its readers is not fixed. It evolves. It changes. It produces meanings the author never intended. He wrote accordingly. Whatever he believed about the divine inspiration of his prophecies, Whatever he thought he was transmitting to posterity, he built his text to last. And it has lasted. Not because its predictions were accurate, but because its structure, its ambiguity, its density, its range, made it permanently available for the work that readers needed it to do. The work was not prophecy. The work was meaning-making. And meaning-making is not a passive activity. It is not something that happens to you. It is something you do, something you bring to a text, to an event, to an uncertain future. When we read Nostradamus' verses and find in them a prediction of something that has just happened, we are not discovering meaning. We are creating it. We are doing what humans do, taking the raw material of experience and shaping it into something that makes sense. This is not a weakness. It is, arguably, one of the most distinctly human things we do. But it is worth being honest about what it is. It is worth knowing that when we reach for Nostradam in a moment of crisis, we are not consulting a prophet. We are consulting a mirror. And what we see in that mirror is not the future. It is our own fear and our own need and our own effort to impose order on chaos. There is no shame in that. It is very human, but it does mean that the future, the actual future, is not in his verses. The future is somewhere else entirely. It is in the decisions being made right now, in the policies enacted and the ones neglected, in the technologies being developed and the ones abandoned, in the conversations being had and the ones refused, in the institutions being built and the ones allowed to decay, in the choices made, one, by the billions of people alive at this moment. No prophet controls those choices. No set of verses, however cleverly constructed, determines how they will fall. Nostradame understood something true about human nature. He understood that we are afraid, and that we search for signs, and that we will find them wherever we look hard enough. He understood that the past rhymes, not because of prophecy, but because human beings are consistent creatures who face consistent challenges and respond in consistent ways. He encoded that understanding in a text that has survived 5 centuries, and will probably survive several more. But understanding our fear is not the same as knowing our future. The future is not written in any quatrain. It is not waiting in any book to be decoded. It is not a message from the past, already fixed and knowable, merely hidden from us by our limited perception. The future is something we are making, right now, whether we know it or not. Maybe Nostradamus didn't predict the future. Maybe he understood something deeper, that humans will always search for signs. The future has never belonged to prophets. It has always belonged to interpretation,